Evening, everybody. Just to take from what Rabbi was saying, it seems like last time we were here, it was a lot hotter in the rooms we were sitting in, and sleeves were considerably shorter. And we all thought we were coming to hopefully the beginning of the end of this, or the end of the beginning at least. But now we're moving on. So from the first, the subject matter for our first series of talks was around the virus itself, and I feel it's no coincidence that at this stage we're now moving to the impact that this pandemic is having on all of us, locally, globally. And so it's a real pleasure to have an hour of your time. And with tonight's panel, in the first talk titled Keeping Calm, next week being Carrying On, but we're joined by Rabbi Aryeh Sufrin, MBE, who's the founder and former director of the Chabad Drugs Lifeline, to Laurie Rackind, the CEO of JAMI, the Jewish Mental Health Service for the Community, and Naomi Dickson, who's the CEO of Jewish Women's Aid. We're going to have a few questions from me to the panel in the early exchanges, and then when we come to the later stages of this evening, we will throw open to questions, and I'll give you the housekeeping rules when we get to that point. But I guess to look at our core topic, which is keeping cool, avoiding meltdowns, addictions, and worse. We're very blessed in the community, clearly, to have the level of welfare and support organizations, the community, the sense of community that we have. But again, all of that is held together by professionals throughout the organization, throughout the community, who are there when things are really in need of escalation. And so we're very lucky to have the leaders of such organizations joining us tonight. So I think as a kind of establishing question, I'm going to go to each of the panel and just a very open question. If you can just in a couple of minutes, just walk us through a virtual tour, essentially, of what your organization provides the community, give us the sense of why people would turn to you when, and the impact you've seen from your organization. So if I can start with Rabbi Sufrin.
Good evening, Stephen. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Thank you, Rabbi Portnoy, for giving me this opportunity and joining together with your very professional and experienced colleagues on the panel, which is a delight to be here with you. And thank you for your initiative in putting an evening like this together, which is obviously so very important in these trying and troubling times. I guess I'm somewhere stuck in the middle here because I was titled as founder and former director of Chabad Drugs Lifeline. Interestingly enough, that Drugsline as an organization doesn't actually exist today in the same way it existed some many years ago now. And it was an organization that took on the challenge of addiction in the community, probably when it was a challenge to even get anybody to consider addiction within the community at all. So it became a great challenge, and I did lead it for 23 years. It got recognition from the Queen, hence I became an MBE through that, and it achieved a tremendous amount during its lifetime, which is about 23 years approximately. But in its then form doesn't exist today. The interesting thing about it is that addictions, drugs, it refers to drugs, but we dealt with any addiction. But addiction in the community is very high up on today's agenda because we're all aware it's very unlikely that people are unaware of someone, whether it's a family or a friend or a distant relative, doesn't have some issues with addiction. So today I'm very involved on perhaps a different level than I was at that time, and that is I'm a private counselor. I do see people on a one-to-one. But the interesting thing about Drugsline is that my name seems to be synonymous with it, even though the organization doesn't actually exist. And that's the impact of that, which it had on the community. So I get endless calls, and we'll talk more about it later. I get endless calls from individuals in the community, schools, or those that are perhaps looking for direction and guidance, because we're still very well aware of the issues that come up and where we should actually take this. So if someone's looking for support, whether it's a support group or there's challenges within the family don't know what to do with an individual that's suffering with with addiction this particular time. Rabbi Sufrin, can you point us in any direction, even if I can't take it on myself? And of course I can't take on every case that comes to us, but we do have a much smaller group now of well-versed people within the community and wider community who are able to address those issues. So I can actually refer to them. And I'll just say finally to the one point that you raised today, and that is, thank God, we're living in a very different community today. Our community today does have so many professionals who are able to address these things. So even if someone is suffering at this point, whether it's them, a family member, they don't have to do it alone. And I'm sure we'll pick that up a bit later also.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rabbi Sufrin. If we move now to Laurie Rackind of JAMI, could you tell us similarly the objectives and the kind of virtual run through of what JAMI can provide the community?
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for inviting me too. In a similar sense to Rabbi Sufrin, JAMI does not look anything like the same service now as it did even 10 years ago, to be honest. When I started at JAMI, I used to describe mental health services generally, but certainly in the Jewish community, as being institutionalized Jewish mothers. They wrap everybody in cotton wool, they serve people chicken soup, and they keep people safe. And it was almost as though, and I think people probably did regard mental illness and mental health issues as a disability. And there was a group of people that unfortunately would become mentally ill. I think we now acknowledge, thankfully, that mental health is a spectrum, just like physical health is a spectrum, and we all move up and down it. And we need to recognize symptoms, we need to develop resilience, we need to develop the skills to recognize, to help ourselves and to help others. So in many respects, JAMI has a two-pronged attack, which is kind of to provide direct support to, and at any one time there's about 1,000, we carry a caseload of about 1,000 people, served by around about 60 mental health professionals, but at the same time working with the rest of the community so that the community is better equipped to recognize mental health issues and knows how to deal with mental health issues. I'm sitting in unfortunately, our virtual cafe, because clearly under current regulations, we're not allowed to operate from there. But that was very much to destigmatize and to bring mental health to the high street and to say to the community, mental health affects everybody. The one issue I would take up with you though is you've given the title of this, Keep Calm. Mental health support is not about keeping calm. Indeed, I could give the analogy, all sorts of different analogies. The ones we give with school kids is of a fizzy bottle of pop, of fizzy drink. If you shake it up and leave the lid on, you don't notice anything, it's calm. You shake it up again, nothing, it's calm. To all intents and purposes, it is keeping calm. But when you open the lid, it could, if you shake it up 5 or 6 times, it absolutely explodes. Whereas if you deal with the situation every time it gets shaken up and release the pressure a bit and deal with the problem and deal with the issue, you won't get that big explosion at the end. Dare I say that huge need for a mental health intervention at the end. So if you don't mind, I'll take issue with the keep calm. It's not about just keeping calm and bottling things up. It's about dealing with issues as they present themselves and learning strategies and how to cope with the issues that all of us find in our lives.
I think that's a very fair point. I claim no involvement with the naming or branding of any event, but no, thank you for that. And actually, you preempted a question I was going to ask at the end of this round of questions around how many users, or service users or participants your organizations have at any one time. And so 1,000 people involved in a program at any one time is quite a number. Naomi Dickson, CEO of Jewish Women's Aid, can I ask you to round off the first cycle and tell us what Jewish Women's Aid does in the community?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's lovely to be here this evening. I hope you'd have all heard of Jewish Women's Aid. We were set up 30 years ago to support any Jewish woman who experiences domestic abuse. We were set up at a time when domestic abuse was an enormous taboo, and at that time it wasn't talked about in the community. And we were set up because some very prescient and far-sighted social workers realised that there were Jewish women living in danger, in dangerous marriages, and they were at risk, and so were their children in their homes. And since then, Jewish Women's Aid has developed and grown to a point where we support around 800 women a year through a whole range of different tools. Our main strategy is to enable the women to live a life free from fear through helping them to minimise the risk that they're experiencing and to help them and their children to be safe. And we support the children through therapy, we support the women through advocacy, casework, support through risk management, emergency accommodation, and counselling and therapeutic groups. So a whole range of services, and we try to be as holistic as possible. We work in conjunction with other organisations like ourselves up and down the country. And people often ask me, why do you need a specifically Jewish organisation?
Right.
And the answer to that question is because we understand the framework that women come to us with. We understand that if they say to us, well, he won't let me light the Shabbos candles, or I need to keep my children in a Jewish school, or how can I celebrate my son's bar mitzvah when this is going on? We understand all of that. And at a point when a woman is incredibly vulnerable and at risk, we provide a soft landing and a safety net. And that's really what we're here for. You know, it goes without saying that abuse can take lots of different forms. It's not just physical. We see emotional abuse and sexual abuse and psychological and verbal abuse and spiritual abuse as well. But we're here to support the women. And the other part of what we do is we aim to break down taboos around domestic abuse, which is what I mentioned at the very beginning. And right now we're doing that by training programs for adults and professionals in the community. A lot of the rabbis on this call I know have been to our trainings, and a lot of the other professionals have as well. And the aim of that is to give people the tools to identify domestic abuse and to signpost women to the right place. And more importantly, almost, is the fact that we go into Jewish secondary schools and we work with UJS and chaplaincy on campus to support as many young people as we can, to give them the tools to enable themselves and to support their friends to have healthy relationships so that we can prevent domestic abuse happening in the future. And all of that pulls together really to make sure that actually we're able to talk about domestic abuse as a community. We know that nationally women will often stay in abusive relationships for 9 years. And the work we've done at Jewish Women's Aid tells us that those women will often stay in abusive relationships for 11.5 years. We've got a huge problem with taboos in the community. And you'll have seen last week with Jewish Women's Aid Shabbat that a lot of the rabbis spoke out. And there were, if you look on our social media and in the press, there were messages from rabbis saying, we know this is an issue in the community. Please seek support from Jewish Women's Aid. And that's absolutely key to our message going forward.
Thank you. I'm going to break with convention of when everyone thanks the speakers at the end of this session, and actually just, I think, listening just for 10 minutes. I think these are things, and it leads to my next question, but these are, I personally hadn't met any of the three of you prior to this evening, and maybe I'm very lucky that I haven't needed to rely on services, but to know that these people like yourselves and organizations like yourselves exist in our community is enormously reassuring to all of us. So thank you for everything that you all do. And related to that, I guess, taking a job like this, and I'm a headhunter, I give people jobs for a living. It takes something very special to choose this. And this is not a vocation, this is a kind of a life mission or a goal. And so before we carry on talking about the more formal elements of what you've observed within your positions, I think just coming back to Naomi to take the next question first, what drew you to this in a minute or two? And has anything surprised you, or have you learned something that you weren't anticipating throughout the course of your time in role?
Well, I've been chief exec of Jewish Women's Aid for 6.5 years, but I actually started volunteering with them 18 years ago. And I did that because I was working in housing and I was managing big housing estates in West London, in Southall, Acton and Ealing. And I always had women coming to me saying, I'm experiencing domestic abuse, however they said it, can you help me? And I remember there was one pivotal moment where I had quite a few women who I was supporting along with all the other tenants on the estate. And one woman called me and she said, I have to get out now. She said, he's going to kill me and you have to help me. And I was really shocked by what I heard, but I was also really privileged to be able to secure housing for her in a safe location where she could move away and break ties with this man. And for me, that was really pivotal because it was really amazing and a huge privilege to be able to make the change in somebody's life at a point that they were happy to, and to help them on their journey. And that's really what I've tried to do in all my time at Jewish Women's Aid. And you know, people often say to me, well, it must be really depressing doing that work. But I honestly think that watching women pick up the bits of their life that they thought they'd shared and put them together to reframe their future and to move forward is really just the most amazing gift to be part of that story. And I suppose what surprised me really is and maybe Laurie and Rabbi Sufrin will say this as well, that it's just the ongoing kind of almost belief that this isn't a big issue in the community, and the constant battle to explain to people that actually, yes, we are as affected by this horror as any other part of society, and actually we can make ourselves better as a community, not by denying that it exists, but by making sure that we've all got the tools to support the women who need us.
Brilliant, thank you. And I guess the same question, if I come back to Laurie now, JAMI.
Thanks, Stephen. I guess I'd describe myself as an entrepreneur who wasn't turned on enough by financial bottom line. Having started my career in the city doing financial modelling and then having my own engineering company for 13, 14 years. A bit like Naomi, I've been chief exec for 14 years now at JAMI, but prior to that, in the mid-90s, I was a volunteer. And the reason I was a volunteer, as I said, I wasn't turned on enough by the bottom line, my company making money. I wanted to do something that I guess was more meaningful. Although my main product did put the little orangey bits in the centre of Jaffa cakes, which I have to say, I think is quite a meaningful existence in itself. Joking aside, I think one of the most surprising things is, and people quite often ask me, you know, how have you transferred engineering into mental health? Right. Well, for a start, I'm not a clinician, and I should kind of preempt every answer I give this evening, particularly if it's anything like a clinical answer. We employ 60-odd mental health clinicians. I am not one of them. So
consider it noted on the record. Fine.
Take that as a given. But what I would say is that I haven't left engineering behind. It's about fixing problems. It's about, there's an issue, how do we solve it? How do we break it down into smaller parts and fix it? And I think much as Naomi was saying, I think what we do have in common is something that the community didn't take seriously enough, somehow felt that it wasn't a particular issue for our community. In mental health, that's particularly surprising because I once did an analysis on the number of mental health professionals that you would expect to be if it was the same per head of population. So psychologists, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, if you did a head count, you would work out that there should only be about 35 Jewish mental health clinicians. Clearly, that is nowhere near the case. We love talking about mental health. We see it as a real issue, but other people's mental health. Yes. So we want to be the psychiatrists, we want to be the psychologists, but we don't want to address our own mental health issues. So I think the challenge for me and the real passion for me is getting the community to acknowledge that absolutely we experience poor mental health like any other community, and that we should be able to do something about it.
Thank you. And Rabbi Sufrin, if we can get just a couple of top line thoughts from you on the same idea.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think there's a lot of synergy between that which Laurie was saying and that which Naomi have both said in the introduction in terms of taboos and so on in the community and what we actually fight for. Well, I was once much younger than I am today, as we all are. And I guess I was not a professional outside of the rabbinic field in all my professional life. So I just knew I was not going to be the pulpit rabbi that's just a pulpit rabbi with not being slanting on anybody who is a pulpit rabbi. It just wasn't for me. I needed something which would take me outside of my synagogue. And I did work the United Synagogue for quite a number of years. And then I'm under now the auspices of Chabad, I have my own synagogue and so on and so forth. But the synagogue life is only a very small part of that which I do in my overall life. And I think the fact that when I stand up in the pulpit and actually speak and I can bring in real stories, you know what happened to me this week, you know what happened with this individual, you know what we were involved with, you know how delicate it was, and at the same time how almost it was challenging it was, and really even dangerous sometimes. And you bring these stories into your sermons and you make them real. That actually gives you an opportunity to be able to share with your community real life scenarios that are going on outside of what they would otherwise see, hear, or experience. Now, I got involved because when I was much younger, I was doing street work. Working on the streets doesn't sound very good, but I was doing street work. And that's where I became engaged with young people that were involved with drugs. And I actually, at the time, knew nothing about it, and it evolved from there. So I became passionate about it. I have a passion around addiction for people, for the community, Jewish community primarily, although I worked, and my MBE was working cross-community, non-denominational, and I still do some work there, but now I brought it back mainly into the community and all aspects of the community. So whereas in the early years, it was, I would say, left of center and the non-Jewish world, today I'd say it's center and right of center, right into the Hasidic community. So numerous of my clients are from the Hasidic community today, where if you think there's taboos in the general community, think about what it must be like in the Hasidic community. I know Naomi for sure will be able to nod her head to that one. And they come, why do they come to see me? Well, I don't live in the hood. I actually live in Ilford, Essex. Some of you may not have even heard of it, but the old jokiness is far from Ilford to Northwest London to Ilford, and we do it quite often. But I'm outside the community, they can come quite comfortably. But I'm very passionate to make sure that, to do my very best, and I'll do this as long as I can, for the community, schools education, synagogue education, parents education, give them an opportunity to know that these things are real. And it's not just Johnny or the odd kid that gets involved. The greater, the numbers are much higher percentage than we'd even think they are of young people that are exposed to it. And it doesn't, if you ask if there's something that surprises me about it, the only thing that came as a later experience to me, which I'm not a lot shocks me today, is how in couples and those who have children and possibly grown children are into addictions of one sort or another as well. And that, you can imagine, has tremendous impact if it's a husband relation to his wife or vice versa, and how that impacts the children and so on. So I've seen across the board over 35 years plus, I've seen how things have actually moved to what was on the periphery community to center of the community, and how I passionately feel about it, that's our role. Our role today is to make people aware and to get rid of the taboos and actually address all of the issues.
Thank you for that. And I think it's worth saying that even if people on this call personally don't feel a requirement themselves for the use of any of these organizations, just by being here and being educated on what these organizations are doing, you can help with intervention with others that might need to be referred into them. So this is not a mass kind of we're not all here to share our own issues if we have them. It's enough to learn that these organizations exist and to refer people as they require. And that kind of leads to my next point, which is I think anyone you ask, anything you read will say that the globe has been going through an unparalleled in our lifetime state of shock and tension and heightened stress levels, anxiety, be it financial, be it health, be it in relationships. Obviously addiction, mental health, and interpersonal relationships suffer predominantly in this environment on a global scale. So I'm going to just a question I'm going to put first of all maybe to Laurie. Laurie, I mean, what is by now we're 70 months into this, I imagine there are some consistencies in presentation, but also in advice. So if there are people who, to your analogy before, feel like, you know, the fizz is bubbling up in the bottle and there's no pressure release, like, how would you advise people who are maybe struggling currently in the current climate?
Common with an awful lot of mental health organisations, initially we didn't get an increase in referrals at all. Things were actually fairly quiet at the start of the pandemic. We always predicted, though, that the mental health curve was going to follow the COVID curve, which we're so used to seeing, and unfortunately was likely to have a far longer tail than the COVID curve itself. And that is coming to fruition now, unfortunately. I don't like to be proved correct, but we were correct. So what happened initially As I said, we didn't get an initial deluge of referrals, but people that had been using our services started re-engaging. If they hadn't used us for 6 months, they would start coming back to us. What we're now finding, though, is people that have never used our services before are coming to us. In certain areas, we're seeing almost 200%, so almost 3 times the referrals in those areas. The 2 major areas we're seeing the spikes are young people and older adults.
How we define, just for clarity, what are the age ranges of
younger
younger and older adults?
Okay. As I get older, younger people get older and older and older. But for the purposes of our data, we tend to use under 25s. So mental health and under 25s, they are referring more, but particularly, and as I said, we're also getting referrals for over 65s as well. The over 65s is an interesting one because although we're seeing the increase in referrals, the recent JPR research wasn't necessarily suggesting that older adults had particular spike in deteriorating mental health. We think that's because we talk about stigma. I think stigma is reducing amongst younger generations. The stigma around mental health is still there in the main for older generations. So the fact that older people are not reporting in surveys the poor mental health doesn't mean that their health is not deteriorating. So I think there's a particular issue, as I mentioned, with older adults, because they were given we don't like diagnoses at JAMI at all. It's about, what is your need for coming to JAMI and what can we solve? We're not interested in following a playbook based on a particular diagnosis. But older people were given the diagnosis of elderly. They were told by the government, stay indoors.
Right.
Think about it, in the main, they were the people that were more likely to be living alone. They were more likely not to have jobs and to have those other networks there, and all their social networks, they happened during the week. They were the ones going to coffee shops and going to the cinema and shul groups and community centres. And they were the one, and it was almost forgotten about. And they would say, you're vulnerable, stay at home. And they stayed at home for 3-4 months. And we know that people that stayed at home throughout this, it's hardly surprising that their mental health has been deteriorating. To answer your specific question, Christine, yes. Talk about it, reach out. The worst thing in mental health terms is to not engage, is to acknowledge before it gets too bad that there is an issue and talk about it. There is there's no harm in doing that and reaching out. And you don't need to talk to a mental health professional in the first instance. You can talk to a neighbour, you can talk to anybody you see. But yes. The fact is, talk about your issues. And a lot of the time, that's the first stage that can almost negate significant interventions further down.
Brilliant. Thank you. And moving on to Naomi, I mentioned before that I work in as a headhunter. I recently did some work with the NSPCC, as it turns out, completely out of the blue and not in the space I'm really working. But a harrowing statistic that I was faced with was that since the lockdown, calls to Childline have increased 40% because people are physically locked in with the people, their abusers. And I assume, I hope I'm wrong, but I fear I'm not, that you've seen a similar impact may have been seen across your network and your user base. So, I mean, I wonder if you can guide us on whether that's the case, and if so, people who are calling you now are facing the additional burdens of a physical lockdown, how best to advise people on how to keep themselves as safe as they can.
Well, unfortunately, you're absolutely right, Stephen. And domestic abuse agencies up and down the country, including us, have all reported a huge increase in the number of women coming forward and telling them that they're living in danger and they're experiencing domestic abuse, which is obviously really, really worrying. And a lot of people who are watching today will remember the media stories at the beginning of lockdown with the very, very highly increased domestic abuse homicide rate, which was absolutely awful and tragic to watch. At Jewish Women's Aid, we've seen a third more women come to us than we would normally expect at this time of year. And those women who are calling us are telling us that not only are they experiencing domestic abuse, but actually they seem to be more prone to be experiencing physical abuse. And obviously the level of anxiety that the women are displaying is going through the roof and is incredibly high. And overlaying all of that, they're very, very concerned about what their children are witnessing. And the children who are living with them are obviously experiencing and witnessing the abuse and are very, very traumatized. So what we've had to do is expand our capacity across all services and make sure that we've got enough caseworkers and counsellors and children's therapists to pick up the pieces to be available. But we've also set up a web chat service, which means that women can go onto our website and chat just by typing into our website and reach one of our caseworkers that way. And what that means is that they can reach help without actually having to speak, because we were talking to women who were saying to me, or to us, you know, I've managed to get away. I've gone out on my daily walk, or I'm in the car. I've got 10 minutes. This is what's going on. And we were becoming increasingly concerned, along with our colleagues in other agencies, that actually the lockdown, whilst well-intentioned, was being used as a tool to perpetrate further abuse for women. Right. And so whilst we've put into place our web chat and we have increased capacity and we've got more women in our service than ever before, you know, one of the big concerns that we share with other agencies is that post-lockdown, there's going to be a further surge in demand for our services.
Right. And this may seem like a very simple and maybe naive question, but in the more Haredi communities, is there an element of lack of communication tools where people aren't necessarily using digital technologies that are internet enabled, that close them off further from what would be an outlet, a digital outlet?
I think it certainly is the case that in some parts of the Haredi community, women have limited digital access to get in touch with our services. I think that's absolutely true. And I'm sure that Laurie and Rabbi Sufrin would concur with that, you know, it's not that any of these evils and horrors are not happening there, but it is incredibly difficult, we know, for women from the parts of the Haredi community to get in touch with us. That doesn't mean to say that they don't manage. Right. And we do have our fair share of Haredi clients, and the proportion of Haredi clients pretty much matches up to the proportion of Haredi people in the community. And in fact, you know, we work with women across the breadth of the community, and the kind of demographics of our client base pretty much matches up to the demographics of the community, which tells me that, you know, nobody's immune, but everybody can access our support if they need. Obviously, we would prefer for everybody to be able to access our support as soon as they need, and that's something that we continue to work on.
Yes, thank you. Rabbi Sufrin, just to move on to a new question. Many organizations, businesses, entrepreneurs, health services have seen that actually, because the completely societal changing impact of a global lockdown, they've actually managed to bring forward innovation and creativity like never before, because they've been faced with a scenario that they've been forced to adapt in. And I wonder, 8 months into this pandemic, has the global COVID pandemic, has it changed the way that your organization is run? Has it changed your modus operandi and the way you deliver services?
Yeah, absolutely has changed. But you know, with challenge comes opportunity.
Exactly.
And what I think we're all adapting to, that this is actually a new way of life. But the way that we are able to, and we were doing it right now, the Zoom community, but the way that we are able to engage with people now is probably in a way that we've never been able to do so before. But we know that the lockdown and Zoom has pluses, and it also has a lot of negatives. The negatives are when people are stuck at home, they have stresses, and the stresses increase, and stresses can lead to relapse, can lead to addictions, and so on and so forth. What else is there to do today? All the pubs are closed. There's nowhere, the gyms are not open. We even heard today that you can't even buy alcohol in some places. So I'm going to do it at home. I have my own place, safe place to be able to do it, and people can get lost in it. Zoom means that we have access computer. We have access computer, then we have access to the internet. We have access to the internet, so then there's porn issues. We also have gambling issues. There is so much that's there at our fingertips that we don't have to go anywhere to do anything. So there's lots of negatives or challenges that can be negative that come with it. But there are also positives. And the positive is that from that same room, which can be the greatest challenge to me, can also gives me the opportunity to reach out. Both Naomi and Laurie have both said ways of, through the internet, to be able to reach out even without having to cross over the threshold of your door to reach out to somebody. There's also there's ways to be able to do this, and perhaps it's not so intrusive, and we're able to hide behind the screen. I don't necessarily have to put on my picture, and so on and so forth. So it could be actually a positive introduction as well. However, as I have found, some people specifically want to see a face-to-face. They don't want to talk through a computer. As beautiful and handsome as you may look, they want to be able to have interaction with real people, especially because they don't have it. So we've had to adapt. Our building has been closed like everybody else's until Wednesday, the second time now. So we have adapted as we did in between. We did all the things where everywhere, okay, it's not as bad as this because you can actually look through a screen, but we've had screens. People are having to talk through screens if they have to come in with a mask, but they can remove the mask when they're actually communicating through the screen, but they're there, you can actually see them. And some people have specifically said, during the lockdown, says, are you able to see people? And I said, no, not at the moment, we have to do it by phone. It says, I'll wait, and started to engage only once we had provided the provision for them to be able to engage on a one-to-one and face-to-face. So it's a balancing act now, where it's going to go from here. I would very much hope that we'd get back to some form of normality, not discounting what Zoom is, because I believe Zoom is the way for the future, and there's so many, or Zoom or a medium like this, and there's so many different ways to be able to do that. But at the same time, I would hope we get back to some normality where we can sit face to face as we would do in a counseling, a therapeutic relationship. Someone sitting in a chair, you're sitting on the chair, you're quite close, but distance enough to have that distance between you, but at the same time, you're engaging with them as real people, not behind the screen. I'll just add one more thing, and that is, we know that in the schools, education, we've fought for education in schools for many, many years, and in some areas been very successful. With the lockdown, we've gone back. We've really gone backwards, because it's very difficult now to actually come into a school and to be able to do what you did in the past because of the provisions that the schools have put in for safety and security and so on and so forth. So there is, in that way, we've actually gone backwards rather than stepping forwards. But that's the challenges that we have at this moment, and hopefully, in due course, we'll be able to revert that back. What the damage in between has happened. We'll have to just face that, as you heard from Laurie before. Just face it. If it's a challenge that we have to open ourselves up and to be faced. And really, for the last thing I want to say for just now, and that is, all the people that are listening today, I think I looked before, I can't see right now whether it's 47, 50 or 39, doesn't really matter. And I think it was Rabbi Portnoy, or possibly Stephen said earlier, you may not actually need any of these services. But I want to tell you something. For me personally, I think it's amazing that you came on, especially if you don't need the services. Exactly. Because all of you now are ambassadors for these services. Because you'll hear people needing it. And then you'll be able to say, well, I heard this, I heard that, and I listened to this talk, and so on and so forth, and there is help there in the community. So Absolutely. It's not a waste in any form or any shape, and I'm sure you'll learn things anyway, but it's not wasting any form, any shape, but you can actually be ambassadors for the wider community to assist them in their needs.
Thanks, Rabbi Sufrin. And the same question, I think, Laurie, I mean, I'm guessing JAMI's also had to adapt. So how have you learnt, how's your modus operandi evolved in the lockdown?
Ironically, I mentioned I started my career as an engineer. I was actually a software engineer, and it took running a mental health charity in a pandemic to become a case study in Computer Weekly. So we're very proud that we finally got into Computer Weekly for demonstrating how we'd engaged with IT. We've recently grown our staff team by about 15 mental health professionals. Even prior to that, we were doing 50% more than we were doing prior to lockdown in terms of the number of interventions. And that's without opening any of the 8 buildings that we traditionally operated from. It's made us, and in many ways, it's just accelerated the progress that we would have made probably over the next 3 or 4 years. Just prior to the pandemic, we'd launched an online counselling tool and mental health resources for students called Couth Student. But very quickly, once the pandemic hit, we launched the same product for adults. as well, called Quell. That would have taken another 18 months to make live, and that's going. That already gives free, confidential online counselling sessions with a real, it's not a virtual counsellor, it's a real qualified counsellor that you're speaking to, but people can do that, as Rabbi Sufrin was saying, in the privacy of your own home, from your mobile phone, from your tablet. We've even issued tablet computers and SIM cards for people that didn't have access to that technology. Also, you can, some of you may have heard, there's a national text-based crisis line called Shout. If you text JAMI now to Shout, you automatically will, yes, you'll get all the resources that Shout provide, but that will also link you back into JAMI and to Jewish mental health services. Across the board, we've really embraced, it's not just Zoom, there's all sorts of different means of engagement. But for me, it's not just engaging with JAMI members of staff. I mentioned that we've been issuing tablet computers and SIM cards. It's the old adage of give someone a fishing rod, don't give them a fish supper. And what we're finding is friendship circles developing. People that have been isolated for decades have found it's taken a global pandemic for some of those shackles of isolation to be lifted from them. And I think there's some amazing positive aspects of the pandemic, if you like, that we're going to benefit from as we come out the other side. All these kind of tools are still going to be there. Our challenge is, as we start opening up, how we blend those physical interactions with the new interventions that we've introduced online. So I actually think it's a really exciting time, as well as being a very, very challenging time.
Brilliant. Can you just, for the benefit of the people on the call, it wasn't quite clear on my line, the URLs of the websites of the new services you've set up.
I'll put them on the chat.
Yeah, put them on the chat. I heard Couth
and Quell. They're all available on the JAMI website. You can leave them from there. So I'll put that, or maybe you could circulate that to
yeah, with pleasure. I'm sure Rabbi Portnoy nod if you're happy with that. I'm sure we can share it all around. Thank you. But just to put you all on notice, I'm going to ask a couple more questions, then we're going to go to Q&A. If you want to ask a question, probably the easiest way to do that is for you to drop me a message on the chat window, and I'll come to you as and when time allows. Coming to Naomi, and I guess this is one that is relevant for everyone, but I thought I'll ask you to lead on it, if that's okay. Obviously, the pandemic has changed, and again, I, with my professional hat on, I speak to CEOs and people who run businesses, and there's a consistent meme, which is people will never go back to work full time again. There will be a change in work, what's known as work-life balance, which is actually commuter and non-commuter balance for those people that work full time. And again, the longer people spend in the longer people in abusive relationships spend in the home with a person that they can't necessarily escape from, is probably detrimental to them rather than beneficial to them. I wonder if what will come on the end of the pandemic and what we're seeing now in terms of the change in the way work-life balance or the working week runs, is that something that you see as an opportunity or potentially a risk, or does it not really change anything in reality to the needs of your users?
It's a really interesting question. But I think from the point of view of our staff and the sector, we've all had to become much more flexible, and the buzzword seems to be, how did you pivot? And you know, we've invested in a ridiculously large amount of laptops because we managed to fundraise for them, which meant that our staff could immediately continue working from home. And interestingly, some of them have embraced working from home. Some of them have really missed the office. I suspect that goes across all industries. But I'd like to think that actually now we've proven that we can work remotely, and that we know that we can offer all the support that we need to women remotely through links like this and through remote counselling. It will add a kind of richness and variety to our service that we didn't have before. At the same time, you know, we've always tried to be as holistic as possible. And so I'd like to think that we might have got there eventually, but it certainly has pushed us to be that much more adaptable than we have been in the past. At the same time, there's some women who we've spoken to who've said that they really, really do want to have kind of face-to-face sessions. You know, just as Rabbi Sufrin said, you know, you just want to be in the same room as somebody, eyeballing them. If you're talking about something as intimate as addiction or intimate partner violence or, you know, rape or you know, any of these awful things, sometimes sitting in a room in your house or just being on the phone in your car is just not good enough. And actually, I do think that working remotely in that respect is a bit of a compromise. And I'd like to think that as soon as we can do safely, we'll be able to welcome women back into our office, which they quite often refer to as like a really safe space. You know, they walk in, they feel safe, it's only women, they can go into a counselling room, they won't be interrupted, they know that they can kind of leave some of their sorrow and baggage there and then move, kind of like shake it off and walk back into their life again. And actually that's a really, really important thing to be able to do physically for a lot of the women that we work with. And the children's service has been quite interesting because usually our children's therapists go into schools or the children come into our office. And actually, because of COVID, what we did was we bought each child a bag full of therapeutic toys, and they have been playing with them remotely on Zoom with the therapists, which again is something that nobody would have planned to do. But actually, what it gave the therapists and the children an opportunity to develop their relationship, and for the children to show the therapist into their bedroom, to their favourite toys. You know, they've managed to build almost a nicer bond, I think, than they might have done otherwise. Just before I finish, one of the things though that we have seen, which I would not want to keep at all, is a much higher level of destitution than we've ever experienced in all the years I've worked at Jewish Women's Aid. And we've seen so many women at the beginning coming to us and saying, actually, you know, the kids' schools are online, and I've got one old laptop between 4 children and I just don't know what to do. And we accessed a grant and supported many women to buy tablets and laptops and Chromebooks and similar for their children. But then on top of that, we were getting women coming to us saying, I can't pay the bills. And the level of economic abuse that we have seen has escalated to a level which I really hope I never see again. And there were women saying that they needed money for utilities, petrol, nappies, food, clothes for Yom Tov. And we've given out thousands and thousands of pounds of grants, which, you know, obviously is a privilege to be able to give out, but you don't want to be in the position where you need to do that.
Yes, thank you for that. And something we should speak about in terms of economic situation, and it's almost kind of my final question before throwing it to the floor. So if you do have questions, please continue to post them here. I assume all of you are actually registered charities as common organisations, and one thing we're also seeing impacted across the entire voluntary, the non-profit sector, is obviously a reduction in statutory, as in government grants, over the last 10 years, as far as I remember, but also now, probably more than ever, private donors are probably feeling the pinch more in their own lives. And so I imagine you need support more than ever. So just in a kind of closing minute each, maybe, Rabbi Sufrin first, how can we, the community, support your organizations?
The point that you raise, you're going to find the same answer from everybody, of course, and it's in every Jewish paper. And I think I saw something in the back of Jewish Chronicle. I don't get often, but I happened to see it this weekend. There was something there at the end about the effect of charitable donations to all of the great charities that we have, thank God, here in the UK. But you know what? I want to tell you something. I believe that the Jewish community per se are amazing in their charity giving, and it's real. And even if at the end of the day one is all the charities are after the same pound from the same people, which is another challenge. People have favorite charities, and we know that that's a reality as well. But I believe that if we engage with the people by sharing them through mediums like this and sharing them about real stories, 3 life stories, which perhaps they are not usually engaged with because this charity does that and might be just very global rather than very individualistic. By making it individual, that you actually help this family, you actually helped us buy that computer, that laptop, that whatever the case may be. With your support, I was able to put that person into a rehab, and in a few months' time to be able to come back to that person and say, this is what your money did. I think it's now we are put into this position of having to, rather than just accepting, put a peel out and it's just going to happen. It's not going to work like that. I don't believe so, not for me anyway. and what is it's much more personal, but it has to be much more realistic in terms of people understanding, you know, that money which I gave actually really did something for somebody because I saw what it did and how it did. And the other point I'd like to make is, yes, grants as a whole is a big, it's a whole gambit on its own. But especially during this pandemic, there have been and there are various pockets of grants which weren't, which are not necessarily usually available. And after we come out of this awful period in our lives, it may not be available then. But there are pockets at the moment, and it's just a matter of looking for them or having people look for them in order to see how does that relate specifically to my charity, and maybe I can get a little slice of that. So it's a two parts. Actually, we're having to look much harder in order to make what we represent and what we're fighting for, what we're passionate about, what our organization represents, more realistic for the donor. And secondly, to have someone on the lookout, which I do have now, and it's only a recent innovation, to look specifically around grants that are related to this pandemic. So rather than general matters, specifically now we are challenged because of, and we have reduction in income because of, and this is what we're doing because of, and that's what we need the money now for, not for some project, perhaps at some later time.
Thank you. And just for context, just to round out, because Laurie mentioned there are 1,000 clients of JAMI at any one time. Naomi mentioned 800 women being impacted by Jewish Women's, or being supported by Jewish Women's Aid. Just to add that layer of context, how many people does the Chabad Drugs Life, well, the current organization's interaction?
Today I can only talk about in the context of myself. I can't be representative of all the therapists in the whole of London and beyond. But I can say to you this, So whereas I have a number of clients on a regular, there's only so much I can deal with that I deal with myself. So 4 or 5 clients a week on an ongoing basis, and rotation, meaning that one drops up, another one comes in. But in terms of people asking for support and in crisis and desperation, so whereas I'll get on average 2 or 3 a week, at the moment I'd say it's doubled. I'd say I'm getting 5 or 6 a week, and I can actually relate this week. Well, and the interesting thing is, it's not about young people. It's actually not about teenagers, school related. It's actually, I'd say, from 28, 30 to the 30 to 55 group. So just try and imagine who's in the 30 to 55 age group today. And in the main, they are family members, a husband, a wife, or a parent calling about their child who is a husband or a wife, and so on. So it's really, it's much more complex, because you're not dealing with one individual, a teenager, perhaps who's running riot in their parents' home. In that home, you're actually talking about parents. You're talking about that couple. So it's a husband and a wife, or vice versa, whichever way it is. There's children there, and there are siblings there. And that's one particular case I'm dealing with, and it came from a sibling who was married, about their father who was in a rehab, and today he's come out a little bit too early. And the reason he came out a little bit too early is by financial reasons. Right. And there's a whole gambit of challenges that come with that.
No, thank you. Laurie, same question. How can we, the community, help JAMI?
Look, you mentioned the reduction in statutory funding. JAMI receives 2% of the £3.5 million budget this year. 2% of it is statutory funding. The rest of it is voluntary income. And we are really thankful to the community. I'm not going to stand here and kind of pitch over above any other cause, but what I would say is about the 3 causes represented here. I think they are definitely causes and needs that are heightened by the pandemic. And as you've heard from the 3 of us, I would say these are areas where we're playing catch up. We haven't traditionally received anything like the funding from the community. I would absolutely subscribe to what Rabbi Sufrin said. As you'd expect from me as an engineer, we measure everything. It's all about impact measurement. It's all about demonstrating best use of resources, and we'll pull resources from certain areas because we know they're more effective than other areas. So I'm absolutely not going to say please give to JAMI or give to Jewish Women's Aid rather than another cause, but we are playing catch up.
Right, thank you. And likewise, Naomi.
I don't really know what else I could add on top of that, apart from to say, as charities, our responsibility is to spend our money carefully and well. We also only get about 7% of our money from statutory sources, and we do rely on the community for a huge amount of support. But I would like to thank the community, because actually, the Jewish Leadership Council did a huge amount of support for welfare, frontline welfare organisations towards the beginning of this pandemic, and people have kind of checked in with us and said, are you okay financially? That doesn't mean to say we're rolling in cash, but it certainly does mean to say that we've been able to expand capacity where we needed to. And I'd like to think that we'll be able to continue to do that after the end of this pandemic. But, the economic impact is something that's already being felt. So I think there's a lot that remains to be seen.
No, we wish you all the best, and hopefully events like this help to underline in people's minds the vital impact you guys have without necessarily people who don't require the services knowing about it. So I'm sure we'll all share with everyone that we speak to around the virtual, well, not Shabbat table, because that would be completely in breach of Shabbat, but the weekdays we'll all tell everyone we know. And we've had some questions, and I wanted to pass them on. We had a couple of questions. If you do want to ask a question, probably people to date have put them through on the chat, so I'll ask them on people's behalf. If I get anything wrong, unmute yourself. But we've had one which we think may have come anonymously, but it's to you, Naomi. What common factors have you noticed as triggers for abusive behaviour? Do these frequently result from a lack of communication between the parties, lack of self-esteem, financial pressures, loss of employment, and are there signs which can be picked up before violence results?
Well, that is an excellent question, and I think if I was able to answer the question properly, I would have done myself out of business. Are there certain behaviours? Having worked with and spoken to hundreds of women over the years, quite often they are able to reflect back to the beginning of their relationship and say, looking back, I could see the signs. And actually what they're normally saying is that at the time, traits that they felt were kind of lovable and attentive then became controlling and abusive. And what we know really is that all the different abusive behaviours that I've described, cutting through all of them is an imbalance of power and control. And those different abusive behaviours are manifestations of that. And I don't think that I always find it very difficult to be able to say to somebody, actually, you could have seen it earlier, or here's something that would have helped you get out, because I don't think it's any victim of abuse's fault that she's in that relationship, or that she's been experienced that level of abuse. Nobody ever should be abused, whatever the triggers, and whether losing a job or bereavement or financial instability or mental health, whatever kind of the told reasons are, nobody should be abused, and it's not any victim's fault that she's been abused. And so I really do struggle with that question. I think what we can do as a community, though, is understand what abuse looks like, understand where to signpost women, have the tools at our fingertips, so that if we are talking to somebody who's experiencing abuse, or we think they might be, we can always say to them something like, do you feel safe? Or how do you feel when he says that to you? Or say to somebody, look, should we go for a walk and we can have a chat? And just, as Laurie said, being a friend and being open to having a difficult conversation, but also understanding that actually you don't need to make it better for that person. You just need to say, here's the phone number, call them and I'll be with you when you do it, can make a huge difference. And you could save somebody's life that way.
Thank you. Really important message, and everyone should pay heed to it. Another question that came through from David Carmel for Laurie and JAMI. Could you say a word or two about anxiety conditions deriving from fear of an invisible threat, and how that's specifically impacting JAMI's work?
Thankfully, I can refer to a remark I gave earlier that I'm not a clinician.
Yes.
To be honest, I wouldn't want to answer.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough.
I think even my clinical colleagues kind of try and avoid specific clinical questions during calls like this. But
yeah, that's absolutely fair enough. Yes, there you go. And one final one to Rabbi Sufrin. Obviously, issues like addiction, they affect the whole of society. They don't really discriminate on race, religion, colour or creed. But are there any specific spikes that we see within the Jewish community, within the subsector of addiction, that are more prevalent or less prevalent in the Jewish community?
It's a real question, and it's often asked. And I think by asking the question itself, also it borders on, I'm not being accusative to anybody, but borders on whether we really understand where the Jewish community is actually placed in relation to the general community.
Right.
And that is that really anything that affects the wider community today affects us. It's just that this is the world that we live in. And because it's the world that we live in, we can be in the same way. Look, we all go to the same schools, we all go to the same shops, we all go to the same places of interest up until the pandemic, of course. But so why should something which is affecting someone who's 18, 25 years old only affect somebody because they're Church of England, but whereas they belong to a synagogue of whichever denomination, it shouldn't affect them? So really, I don't believe that it is. There was a time we used to say that gambling was a Jewish problem. You know, that's years ago, before we had the internet. Today, everybody's problem. Drinking was a Jewish problem. Why? Because our whole lives are surrounded around drink, from the time the kid has a bris, a circumcision, to the wedding, to the bar mitzvah, to the bat mitzvah, everything's all around the bar. What happens? In fact, that's what it's called, right? Bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah. So it's all around the bar today. And less on the mitzvah, it's around the bar. So drinking was a big element. But we have so many other things today, which is, we have eating disorders. Is eating disorder a Jewish thing? Boy, it really goes on the Jewish community. Unfortunately, pornography, unfortunately, it exists in the Jewish community. And what we're finding, or what I'm finding, somebody I'm working with particularly now, in a very happy marriage. How did that happen? Well, searching it, what we did find out is in discuss is that this kid was abused when he was, I'm not saying that is the only reason, but he was an abused kid in the school system, and it was never dealt with. And it's only coming out now as a husband with 3 children. So it's across the board, and I don't think we should be surprised by hearing anything and think, oh, I didn't think, you know, that hopefully that is gone. You know, I didn't think that went on in the Jewish community. Personally, I think I've outgrown that, because people just, if they talk to me, then they think, oh, then they're identifying with something related to addictions. But today, I wouldn't say there's anything specific. I think we do go through various cycles, and we might find that one particular addiction is coming to the forefront, and that not because it's happening now, which didn't happen before. It's because maybe it's something in the media that's brought it to the forefront of everybody. Maybe it's a good television series, maybe it's a good television program, or maybe it's in the newspapers at the moment, and it's related to a star footballer, or whatever the case may be. So, oh, that relates to us. All of a sudden, it comes to the forefront. But as a whole, I wouldn't be sitting here and saying this is the Jewish community.
Yes, thank you. I want us to end on a positive note. It's very important. First of all, and to echo everything that we've already been said, the fact that it's a real show of optimism that everyone's, for me at least, in the strength of our community, that people have come on a Monday evening to learn about these absolutely invaluable organizations run by absolutely unsung heroes, in my view, in the community. So I'm going to give them a 20-second kind of head start to think of something optimistic or a positive message from their own professional experience they can share that's happened in the last 8 months. You should know at the closing segment of the last round of Rabbi Aryeh Alei Zion and Magen Avot talks, I asked the 3 speakers when they thought we'd be back in shul, and they counted for a kiddush. And I said, well, back in shul is one thing, for a kiddush is a completely different one. So, and it turns out so far they were right. So we're now a few months into this, but maybe I'll start. I've given Naomi the longest longest break. So can you give us in a minute, Naomi, just some kind of beam of light, something optimistic or positive that's come from the last 8 months in the work that you do?
Well, you know, my line of work is not particularly cheerful normally, because of the sad and tragic stories that we hear every day. But I suppose the optimistic part of me is happy that women are able to seek our support, the community has opened up enough that, you know, we've got senior rabbis at all levels across the breadth of the community who are happy to talk about domestic abuse as an issue in our community. And what that's done is it's given permission to seek support and to come forward. And so more women than ever before, along with their children, are leaving our service in a much better place than when they came into our service, and are able to live a life free from abuse and fear. And for me, that's a really positive note.
Fabulous. Laurie?
Simple one for me. Almost every article you read, every news bulletin, conversation with a celebrity, a business leader talks about mental health. That didn't happen. It certainly didn't happen 5-6 years ago, and it didn't happen before the pandemic. And as I mentioned, just talking about mental health is half the battle. So just the very fact that it's part of common dialogue now is a huge positive, which will stay with us.
Good. And Rabbi Sufrin?
Well, I'm Mr. Optimist. So first of all, the fact that we're having this discussion here today, and I see a number of my colleagues, Rabbi Ginsbury, Rabbi Kennisberg, it's very nice to see you here. Of course, Rabbi Portnoy, who got me here in the first place. That in itself is a tremendous plus. To know that there is the leadership of our community who are really open and addressing these issues, and where do we hope that in the Jewish community, the rabbis are in touch enough that people will come to them and say, Rabbi, I have a problem, and you know where I can go. So that in itself is something. The other point I wanted to make is this, that very often you hear, and we've been talking a lot about it, and you said, let's look for something optimistic, that when we talk about the issues which have been raised here tonight, they are very sad. I think this is where our Jewish community is. We've got to address all of these issues. But look how much good is actually being done and achieved by the organizations who are supported, as you heard in the main, by charitable donations in order for them to happen, which means partnerships with your greater, whatever percentage of the community are giving those charitable things. But there are so many great stories. You know, if we were able to share with you a positive story, 8 months ago, I'll just do it quickly. 8 months ago was a guy that was, he's 44 years old, been in and out of rehab, I can't tell you how many times. Unfortunately, he lost his parents, he lost his brother, all of whom I knew. I knew this boy since he was 7 years old. And we put him into rehab. It failed. He came out. We never gave up on him. Because we believe that relapse is part of the process of recovery. Relapse is not the end of the journey. Relapse is part of the journey. And thank God he made it all the way. And for the last 8 months, he is now what we call in recovery. And he was on Sky News just a week ago telling his story. And you know, for me to be able to see that, and knowing that I can't claim responsibility for all of it, but knowing that I had a little part in it, it makes everything worthwhile. We know from the Jewish perspective that, you know, saving a person is saving a whole world, and it really is. And every time you see, Laurie, when you see something coming through JAMI and you know you've had a positive impact, Naomi through JWA, and I know a lot about JWA, every time you know that you've done something positive to assist the pain and anguish of another family or another individual, that's a positive for our community. Should we be here? Of course we shouldn't be here. Would we want to be here? Of course we don't want to be here. But you know, today we have responses to it. And that will be my last point. Rather than, and this is really just, and I just want to end with this, just because a person can deal with something doesn't mean that you have to deal with it on your own. So even if you feel that you're capable to be able to face that challenge, that particular challenge, you don't have to do it on your own. There is a world of help out there and support that can help you along, and to give you that additional support so that you shouldn't crash in the process of dealing with a particular crisis. So I will close by saying thank you to all of you, and thank you to the Hendon Synagogue, Rabbi Portnoy, for organizing this. And as soon as he asked me, I did say, you know, it would be my pleasure in as much as I feel this is so important. So whatever else anybody else was doing, I felt it important enough to just put it aside and come on. So if there's anybody wants to be in contact with me, then Stephen has those details.
Yes, and that was well. First of all, thank you all, and massive thank you to Rabbi Sufrin, to Laurie, Rackind, and Naomi Dickson for coming on tonight. And there's not enough, you have an MBE, there aren't enough gongs we could throw at the three of you that would in any way show our gratitude for everything you've done for us and the community. And they would never ask, but I'm more than happy to say, if people are in a position to support these charities, they should. But even if you don't want to support them financially, just telling people in the community that you've been at this talk and educating someone, to quote Naomi before, you can save someone's life. If you potentially, we don't know where people are at, but just communicating, sharing the knowledge you've picked up tonight could have an enormous impact on someone or more than one person who can pass it on. So I think that's something we can all do. It costs us nothing but some time. And thank you for your time, everyone, this evening. To echo what Rabbi Sufrin said, thank you to Roddy Close, Magen Avot and Alei Zion for putting this together. Thank you, Rabbi Portnoy. And next week, we meet again on the 7th of December, the next Monday, for the second part, Carrying On, assuming we park Laurie's objection to keep calm. It kind of works as Carry On as part 2. You go with it, it's a meme. We're going to be talking about keeping on top of financial, employment and admin needs with Debbie Sheldon, the CEO of Work Avenue, Bela Perrin, the CEO of the Paperweight Trust, and Victoria Sturman, the CEO of Resource. And everyone, I'm sure, is very welcome on these details. I'm sure there'll be emails coming through, and everyone have a good evening. Stay safe, even when the lockdown is eased. Stay safe. And yes, have a good evening. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Stephen.
I think Rabbi Kenningsberg was going to say some closing words there, but not quite sure about that.
Thanks, Rabbi Ginsberg. I'm not sure there's too much to add. Just thank you to everybody. Thank you to Stephen, who I think is gone, but Stephen for moderating, and to all our panelists. Again, just to echo, thank everybody for not just this evening, but for all that they do, and hope to see everybody next week.
Thank you very much. Thank you.